How did ancient people make sense of the world? I'm not just talking about their own backyard, but everybody. Today we're diving into one of the most ambitious documents from antiquity, a kind of master family tree that tried to explain the origin of, well, everyone.
Okay, so you probably know the basic story. After a massive flood hits, the world gets a hard reset. And it all starts again with just one family: Noah, his wife, their three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. The idea is that from these 8 people, literally every nation on Earth would eventually spring up.
But that's the big question, right? How in the world do you go from just 3 sons to a whopping 70 nations? Well, the answer is tucked away in a single, incredible chapter of Genesis that has fascinated and, frankly, confused people for thousands of years.
To get our heads around this, we have to look at what's called the Table of Nations. You can think of it as a kind of blueprint for this new post-flood world. It was a way for this ancient culture to organize and understand all the different peoples they knew about, and even the ones they didn't. So what is it exactly? Well, at its core, the Table of Nations is a super detailed genealogy. It lists out 70 descendants from Noah's sons, and then describes how they all spread out across the globe, each with their own language, family, and nation. It's this really unique attempt to create one single unified history for all of humanity.
The whole thing really just hangs on these 3 sons. First, you've got Japheth's descendants, who are generally associated with lands to the north and west. Then there are Ham's descendants, and they're linked to the south, think Africa and parts of Arabia. And finally, Shem's line, which traces the peoples of the Near East.
Now here's the really wild part. For centuries, people didn't see this as just a list of names. No way. They treated it as a literal map of the known world, a divine guide to how all the continents were first populated.
I mean, just look at this. This is a TO map from 1472. It was a super common way of drawing the world back in medieval Europe, and it perfectly shows the influence of Genesis 10. You can see the world neatly carved up into 3 continents: Asia for Shem's descendants, Europe for Japheth's, and Africa for Ham's. It's all right there.
And get this, it wasn't just some dusty old medieval idea. This thinking had an incredibly long shelf life. Even as late as 1854, you had maps like this one being made, trying to chart the globe based directly on the geography laid out in the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, and this is a big but, trying to read this ancient text like it's a modern GPS or a history textbook, well, that's where you run into some serious challenges. The whole thing is really a puzzle, filled with symbolic numbers and what look like, contradictions.
And that brings us to the number itself, 70. Why 70 nations? Well, in the ancient world, numbers were a huge deal. They had deeper meanings. 70 wasn't just a random count. It was a symbolic number that represented wholeness or completeness. It pops up elsewhere too, like the 70 descendants of Jacob who went to Egypt. So the author was likely painting a picture of a complete, unified humanity.
And when scholars dig in, they find all these little textual puzzles. For instance, the names Sheba and Havilah, they actually show up in the family lines of both Ham and Shem. And Cush is linked to North Africa, but his son Nimrod supposedly founded cities way over in Mesopotamia. Plus, a lot of famous ancient peoples, like the Persians, the Romans, they're just not there because they were simply outside the author's world.
Now, as time went on, this ancient document started to be interpreted in new and, frankly, some very troubling ways.
So, in the 18th century, a group of European scholars took these 3 family lines, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and coined the terms Semites, Hamites, and Japhethites. By the 19th century, that framework was being used to build early racial categories, which of course have been completely discredited today. It's a really important and difficult part of the history of how this text was understood and misused.
But the Table of Nations isn't just about this big, sweeping picture of humanity. It also holds these incredible little mysteries in the details. So let's zoom way in on just one name: Tarshish, a descendant of Japheth. This one name has basically launched a centuries-long archaeological detective story.
So, the Bible describes Tarshish as this faraway, almost mythical place that was incredibly rich in silver. For the longest time, though, nobody could figure out where it was. Its location was a total mystery, partly because of a really fascinating translation error that sent everyone looking in completely the wrong direction.
All right, here's the clue. A passage describing the cargo coming from Tarshish had a couple of really tricky Hebrew words. The original text was probably talking about metallic goods, something like knives and razors, but a much later translation interpreted them as apes and peacocks. That one little change created this exotic, tropical image that made explorers think of Africa or India, miles away from the real spot.
And here's another piece of the puzzle that snapped things into focus. The phrase ships of Tarshish didn't always mean ships sailing to the city of Tarshish. A lot of the time, it just referred to a type of ship. You know, a big, heavy-duty, long-distance vessel. It's kind of like how we might say an oil tanker today without saying where it's going.
So once you fix those two mix-ups, boom, all the evidence starts pointing overwhelmingly in one direction, west, out into the Mediterranean. The prophet Jonah hops on a ship in Jaffa. To escape to Tarshish, the Psalms put it on the opposite side of the world from Sheba, which is in Arabia. Even sources outside the Bible, like inscriptions from an Assyrian king, list Tarshish as an island way out west.
So after all this, what are we supposed to make of this incredible document today?
You know, as the scholar R.N. Wybray points out, the Table of Nations is really one of a kind. There's just nothing else like it from the ancient world. This massive attempt to organize and unite all of humanity into one big family tree. It's pretty amazing. So if you take one thing away from this, it should be this. The Table of Nations isn't a science textbook or a literal two-scale map. It's a cultural map. It's this incredible window into how one ancient people saw their world, their neighbors, and their own place in the grand story of it all.
For thousands of years, this text provided a framework for how people understood geography, ethnicity, and history. And as we keep digging into its language and its context, it's still offering us clues, not just about the past, but about how these ancient stories are still shaping our world today. Makes you wonder, what will we find next?